Kenjiro Aoki never imagined that the smell of fresh bread would lead him straight into enemy territory. The 43-year-old shopkeeper had been hiding in the caves of war-torn Saipan for weeks, watching American soldiers patrol the rubble where his neighborhood once stood. But when that unmistakable aroma drifted through the morning air, something inside him broke. His 5-year-old daughter Yuki hadn't eaten in 3 days, and his wife Mariko could barely stand from weakness. The smell wasn't just bread. It was life itself calling to them. What he found at that American field kitchen would challenge everything he believed about war, enemies, and the true meaning of humanity. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The morning sun cast long shadows across the devastated landscape of Saipan, as Kenjiro Aoki crouched behind the twisted remains of what had once been a concrete wall. His weathered hands gripped a rusty piece of metal, not as a weapon, but as support for his weakened body. 3 weeks had passed since the American forces had taken control of the island. 3 weeks of hiding, scavenging, and watching his family slowly starve. Kenjiro's eyes swept across the barren field before him, taking in the scattered debris of war. Broken palm trees stood like skeletal fingers against the morning sky, their fronds long since burned away by artillery fire. The ground was pocked with craters, some filled with stagnant rainwater that reflected the gray clouds overhead. In the distance, he could see the makeshift tents and structures of the American military camp, a sprawling complex of olive green canvas and wooden posts that had sprung up like mushrooms after rain. The smell hit him like a physical blow to the chest. Fresh bread, warm and yeasty, carried on the humid Pacific breeze. Kenjiro's stomach clenched painfully, reminding him of the gnawing emptiness that had become his constant companion. He closed his eyes and inhaled deeply, allowing himself a moment to remember what it felt like to be truly satisfied, to sit at his family's table with a full belly and plans for tomorrow. Behind him, in the cave that had become their makeshift home, he could hear Yuki whimpering softly in her sleep. His daughter's once round cheeks had hollowed out, her bright eyes now sunken and dull. Mariko lay beside her, barely conscious, her breathing shallow and labored. They had survived on scraps, on rainwater collected in broken pottery, on the occasional root or wild berry that hadn't been contaminated by the chemicals of war. The bread smell grew stronger, more insistent, as if the wind itself was trying to guide him forward. Kenjiro had worked in his uncle's bakery as a young man, before he opened his small shop selling household goods and sundries. He knew that smell intimately, could distinguish between different types of flour, could tell when yeast was perfectly active, and dough had risen to its optimal point. This wasn't the dense, dark bread they had sometimes managed to make during the worst of the rationing. This was something lighter, airier, made with ingredients that had become mythical luxuries. His rational mind screamed warnings. The Americans were the enemy, the same soldiers who had rained fire from the sky, who had driven his neighbors from their homes, who had turned his peaceful island into a hellscape of smoke and destruction. Every propaganda poster, every radio broadcast, every whispered conversation had painted them as devils in human form, ruthless killers who showed no mercy to civilians. But his heart, his desperate father's heart, whispered something different. What if there was a chance, however small, that food might be available? What if the Americans, now that the fighting had ended, might show some compassion to the starving people they had conquered? The thought seemed almost blasphemous, but hunger had a way of making even the most impossible ideas seem reasonable. Kenjiro made his decision with the same quiet determination that had carried him through 20 years of marriage and 15 years of running his small business. He would investigate the source of that smell, and if there was any possibility of obtaining food for his family, he would swallow his pride and ask for help. The alternative was watching Yuki and Mariko slowly waste away in their cave, and that was a fate he could not accept. Moving carefully through the rubble, Kenjiro began his journey toward the American camp. Each step required careful planning, as loose stones and twisted metal could easily give away his position. He had learned to move like a ghost during these weeks of hiding, stepping only on solid ground, avoiding anything that might clatter or shift under his weight. The devastation around him told the story of Saipan's last stand in stark, brutal detail. Here was the remains of the Nakamura family's house, identifiable only by the distinctive blue tiles that had once covered their roof. There was the twisted frame of a bicycle, probably belonging to young Hiroshi, who had delivered newspapers before the war came to their shores. Every piece of debris held memories, fragments of a life that seemed as distant as a dream. As he moved closer to the American camp, Kenjiro began to encounter other survivors. First, he spotted old Mrs. Watanabe peeking through the ruins of what had been the market square. Her gray hair was matted and dirty, her clothes little more than rags, but her eyes still held the sharp intelligence that had made her the unofficial leader of the neighborhood women's association. When she saw him, she gestured urgently for him to come closer. "Aoki-san," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the morning breeze. "You smell it too, don't you? The bread?" He nodded, surprised to discover he wasn't the only one who had been drawn by the tantalizing aroma. "My family hasn't eaten in days, Watanabe-san. I have to try something." The old woman's face was a map of worry and hope wrestling for dominance. "My grandson Kenji is with me. He's only 7, and so thin I can see his ribs through his shirt. But the Americans, Aoki-san, what if it's a trap? What if they're trying to lure us out so they can finish what they started?" "Saf." The question hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire. It was the same fear that gnawed at every survivor, the terror that any attempt to emerge from hiding would result in immediate death. Yet the smell of bread continued to drift across the wasteland, growing stronger with each passing moment. "I don't know," Kenjiro admitted, his honesty a small gift in a world that had become defined by deception and survival. "But I know that if we do nothing, if we continue to hide and starve, the result is the same. At least this way, we have a chance." Mrs. Watanabe was quiet for a long moment, her weathered fingers unconsciously smoothing the fabric of her torn dress. Then, she nodded slowly. "Kenji is sleeping in the old storm drain behind the pharmacy ruins. If you're going to investigate, I'll wake him and follow at a distance. If something happens to you, we'll know to stay hidden. If you find food, it. She didn't finish the sentence, but the hope in her eyes completed the thought. Word of Kenjiro's planned expedition spread quickly among the hidden survivors. By the time the sun had climbed higher in the morning sky, a small group had assembled in the shadow of a collapsed building. There was Mrs. Watanabe with young Kenji, a boy whose serious eyes seemed too old for his thin face. Mr. Ishida, a former teacher whose left arm hung useless from an injury sustained during the bombing, had emerged from wherever he had been sheltering. 3 women whose names Kenjiro didn't know but whose faces were familiar from his shop had appeared as well, each carrying bundles that probably contained their few remaining possessions. The group moved like a pack of cautious animals approaching a watering hole in lion territory. Every few steps, someone would freeze at the sound of distant voices or the rumble of machinery. They communicated mostly through gestures and meaningful looks, each person hyper-aware that their lives might depend on absolute silence. As they crept closer to the American camp, the bread smell became overwhelming. It wasn't just one batch baking, Kenjiro realized, but multiple ovens working continuously. The scale of the operation suggested something far beyond what would be needed to feed the soldiers alone. Could it be possible that the Americans were actually preparing food for the civilian population? The idea seemed too incredible to believe, yet the evidence of his nose was undeniable. Mixed with the bread, he could now detect other aromas, vegetable soup perhaps, and something that might have been meat cooking. His mouth began to water involuntarily, and he had to concentrate to keep from breaking into a desperate run toward the source of these incredible smells. Through a gap in some fallen concrete blocks, Kenjiro caught his first clear view of the American field kitchen. What he saw challenged every preconception he had held about the enemy soldiers. A long line of tables had been set up under canvas awnings, manned by soldiers in clean uniforms who were actively serving food to anyone who approached. And there were civilians in that line, Japanese civilians, men and women and children, who looked just as desperate and hungry as his own group. The Americans weren't checking identification papers or demanding anything in return for the food. They were simply ladling soup into bowls, cutting thick slices of bread, and handing out portions with what appeared to be genuine care and concern. Kenjiro watched in amazement as one soldier, a young man who couldn't have been more than 20, knelt down to hand a piece of bread directly to a small child who was too weak to reach the table. The child, a little girl about Yuki's age with matted black hair and a dress that was more patches than original fabric, took the bread with trembling hands and immediately began to eat with the desperate intensity of someone who had forgotten what it felt like to be full. The soldier didn't walk away immediately, but stayed crouched beside her, speaking softly in what sounded like broken Japanese, his voice gentle and encouraging. Kenjiro felt something inside his chest crack open, like ice breaking up in the spring sun. These were not the monsters he had been told to expect. These were young men, many of them probably with families of their own back home, who had chosen to feed hungry children instead of turning them away. But even as hope began to bloom in his heart, fear maintained its grip on his common sense. This could still be an elaborate trap, a way to identify and round up the remaining civilian population for whatever purpose the occupying army might have in mind. He needed more information, needed to understand what was really happening before he could risk exposing his family to potential danger. He gestured to Mrs. Watanabe and the others to remain hidden while he moved closer for a better view. Using the cover provided by an overturned truck, he was able to approach within 50 feet of the food line. From this vantage point, he could see and hear much more of what was happening. The conversations between the American soldiers and the Japanese civilians were a fascinating mix of broken English, elementary Japanese, and elaborate hand gestures. One soldier was trying to explain something about nutrition to an elderly man, pointing to different foods and using simple words like, "good for you," and "make strong." The old man nodded eagerly, clearly understanding more from tone and context than from the actual words being spoken. At another station, a medic was examining a woman's infected wound while she waited in the food line. He cleaned it gently, applied what looked like antibiotic ointment, and bandaged it with professional competence. When he finished, he handed her a small package that probably contained additional medical supplies, and gestured for her to return in a few days for another check. The most revealing moment came when Kenjiro overheard a conversation between two American officers standing near the edge of the serving area. They were speaking in English, unaware that he had learned enough of the language during his school years to follow the general meaning of their words. "Colonel Morrison wants us to increase the daily bread production by another 30%, the taller officer was saying. "Intelligence estimates there are still at least 200 civilians hiding in the caves and ruins around the perimeter. That's going to strain our supply lines," the other man replied. "We're already using more flour and medical supplies than was budgeted for civilian relief operations." The colonel's orders were clear. No one on this island should go hungry while we have the resources to prevent it. These people have been through hell, and now that the fighting's over, it's our responsibility to help them rebuild their lives. The words hit Kenjiro like a physical blow. Responsibility to help them rebuild their lives. Not punishment, not revenge, not even indifference, but an active commitment to healing and restoration. It seemed too good to be true, yet he was hearing it directly from the lips of the men in charge. His internal struggle intensified. Every instinct for self-preservation told him to remain hidden, to protect his family by avoiding any contact with the occupying forces. But his conscience, informed now by what he had seen and heard, whispered that he might be denying his loved ones their best chance for survival by continuing to hide. The decision was made for him when young Kenji, Mrs. Watanabe's grandson, broke away from their hiding place and began walking directly toward the food line. The boy had been driven beyond rational thought by hunger and the sight of bread being freely distributed. Mrs. Watanabe tried to call him back in a harsh whisper, but Kenji either didn't hear or chose to ignore her plea. Kenjiro watched in fascination and terror as the 7-year-old approached the American soldiers. The boy was clearly terrified, his small body shaking with each step, but he continued forward with the determination of someone who had nothing left to lose. When he reached the serving table, he stopped and bowed formally, the gesture automatic despite his fear and hunger. The soldier manning that station, a stocky man with kind eyes and prematurely gray hair, looked down at Kenji with an expression of such gentle concern that Kenjiro felt his throat constrict with emotion. The man said something in English, then seemed to realize the child didn't understand, and switched to halting Japanese. "Hungry?" the soldier asked, the word carefully pronounced though his accent made it almost unrecognizable. Kenji nodded vigorously, his eyes never leaving the loaves of white bread stacked behind the soldier. The man smiled and reached for one of the larger pieces, then seemed to reconsider and selected an even bigger portion. He placed it carefully in the boy's outstretched hands, then added a bowl of soup and what looked like a piece of chocolate from his own personal supplies. The transformation in Kenji was immediate and miraculous. The fear drained from his face, replaced by wonder and gratitude so pure it seemed to illuminate the air around him. He bowed again, deeper this time, then retreated a few steps and began to eat with the focused intensity of someone who had nearly forgotten what food tasted like. Other soldiers had noticed the interaction, and several of them gathered around to watch the boy eat. Their faces showed not triumph or superiority, but something much more complex. A mixture of sadness at the child's obvious suffering and satisfaction at being able to provide relief. One of them produced a small notebook and pen and began sketching Kenji as he ate, apparently wanting to capture the moment of a hungry child receiving nourishment. The scene was so different from everything Kenjiro had been told to expect that he felt disoriented, as if he had walked into an alternate version of reality where the rules of war and occupation had been rewritten by Fana, some benevolent force. These men were treating a child of their former enemy with more kindness than some of Kenji's own neighbors had shown during the hardest days of rationing. Mrs. Watanabe could stand it no longer. Seeing her grandson safe and fed, she emerged from hiding and walked quickly toward the food line. Her approach was more cautious than Kenji's had been, but there was determination in her stride that Kenjiro recognized. She had made her choice, and she would face whatever consequences might follow. The soldiers greeted her with the same gentle professionalism they had shown her grandson. They served her food without question, and when she tried to refuse the soup, saying through gestures that she only needed bread, they insisted she take a full meal. One of them even found a wooden crate for her to sit on while she ate, understanding without words that her elderly legs might not support her for long. The dam of fear that had been holding back the other survivors finally cracked. One by one, they began to emerge from their hiding places and approach the American food line. Mr. Ishida came first, his injured arm making him vulnerable, and perhaps giving him courage born of desperation. The three women followed, supporting each other both physically and emotionally as they took their first steps into this new reality. Each interaction followed a similar pattern. The Americans greeted each new person with patience and kindness, served generous portions of food, and provided medical attention when needed. There were no interrogations, no demands for information, no suggestion that this charity came with strings attached. The soldiers seemed genuinely committed to the simple act of feeding hungry people, and their sincerity was impossible to fake or misinterpret. Watching his neighbors receive this unexpected grace, Kenjiro felt the last of his resistance crumble. His family was dying in their cave, while safety and sustenance waited just a few hundred yards away. Whatever risks might be involved in trusting these American soldiers, they could not be greater than the certainty of starvation that awaited if he continued to hide. The walk from his hiding place to the food line felt like the longest journey of his life. Each step carried him further from the world of assumptions and propaganda he had inhabited for months, and closer to a reality that seemed almost too hopeful to be real. His legs shook with weakness and nervousness, but he forced himself to maintain a steady pace, knowing that any sign of panic or sudden movement might be misinterpreted as threatening. When he reached the serving table, the soldier who had been so kind to Kenji looked up and smiled. The man's face was weathered and tired, showing the strain of months of combat, but his eyes held genuine warmth. He said something in English, then tried again in his broken Japanese. "Welcome," the soldier managed, the word coming out as welcome but perfectly understandable in its intent. "You hungry?" Kenjiro nodded, not trusting his voice to work properly. The soldier began loading a tray with food, bread, and soup, and what looked like canned vegetables. The portions were generous, far more than one person could eat, and Kenjiro realized the man had understood without being told that he would be sharing this meal with his family. Family? the soldier asked, confirming Kenjiro's suspicion. Wife? Children? Yes, Kenjiro whispered, the English word feeling strange on his tongue. Wife sick, daughter hungry. The soldier's expression grew more serious, and he added additional items to the tray, including what appeared to be medical supplies and extra food. Then, he did something that completely shattered Kenjiro's remaining defenses. He reached into his own pocket and pulled out a small wrapped candy, the kind American soldiers apparently carried as personal treats. He placed it carefully on top of the other supplies and pointed toward it. For daughter, he said in his careful Japanese. Make smile. The simple gesture, the idea that this foreign soldier cared enough about Yuki's happiness to give up his own candy, broke something loose in Kenjiro's chest. Tears, he didn't know he had been holding back, began to flow down his cheeks, and he found himself bowing repeatedly, trying to express gratitude that had no words in any language. The soldier seemed to understand, and he reached across the table to briefly touch Kenjiro's shoulder in a gesture of comfort and connection. Then he pointed toward a group of other families who were sitting nearby eating their meals, indicating that Kenjiro was welcome to join them or take the food back to wherever his family was waiting. Kenjiro chose to return to the cave, knowing that Mariko and Yuki were too weak to make the journey to the American camp and too frightened to trust what they couldn't see for themselves. The walk back felt different from his approach, lighter somehow, despite the weight of the food he carried. He was no longer sneaking through enemy territory, but walking through a world where unexpected mercy had replaced anticipated cruelty. The cave that had sheltered his family looked smaller and more dismal when he returned, made shabby by contrast with the organized efficiency and purposeful kindness he had witnessed at the American camp. Mariko was awake when he entered, her eyes widening with alarm when she saw him carrying obviously foreign supplies. "Kenjiro," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What have you done? Where did you get this food?" He knelt beside her and began unpacking the tray, his movements deliberate and calm despite the urgency he felt to get nourishment into his family. "The Americans," he said simply. "They're feeding people. All people. They asked for nothing in return." Mariko's face showed a complex mixture of hope and terror. "It must be a trap," she said, but her eyes were fixed hungrily on the bread he was placing before her. "They're trying to gather us together so they can what?" Kenjiro interrupted gently. "Feed us? Give us medical care? Treat our children with kindness?" He held up the candy the soldier had provided for Yuki. "This came from a young man's own pocket, Mariko. He wanted our daughter to have something sweet." Yuki stirred at the mention of her name, her small nose twitching as the smell of fresh bread penetrated her dreams. When she opened her eyes and saw food, real food, spread out before her, she didn't ask questions or express concerns about its source. She simply reached for the nearest piece of bread and began eating with the single-minded focus of a starving child. The sight of his daughter eating, really eating for the first time in days, filled Kenjiro with a joy so intense it was almost painful. He watched her small hands tear pieces from the soft loaf, watched her cheeks work as she chewed, watched her eyes brighten as strength began to flow back into her small body. This was what mattered. This was what made everything else worthwhile. Mariko took longer to overcome her reservations, but eventually hunger and hope won out over fear. She began with small bites, testing the food as if it might be poisoned, but soon she too was eating with increasing enthusiasm. The soup was rich and nourishing, clearly made with ingredients that had been impossible to obtain during the months of fighting and deprivation. As his family ate, Kenjiro found himself thinking about the soldier who had been so kind to him, wondering what had motivated such generosity toward people who had so recently been considered enemies. The man was young, probably no older than Kenjiro himself, with laugh lines around his eyes that suggested a naturally cheerful disposition. He wore a wedding ring, which meant he probably had a family of his own, somewhere in America, people who were waiting for him to come home safely from this terrible war. Yet instead of counting the days until he could leave, instead of harboring resentment toward the people whose country had necessitated his presence here, this soldier had chosen to spend his time and energy, and even his personal treats, on feeding hungry strangers. It was an act of grace, that Kenjiro was still struggling to fully comprehend. The implications of what had happened extended far beyond a single meal, important as that was for his family's immediate survival. If the Americans were genuinely committed to helping the civilian population, if their presence on Saipan was going to be marked by mercy rather than vengeance, then everything about the future would have to be reconsidered. The possibility of rebuilding, of creating something new from the ashes of what had been destroyed, suddenly seemed real rather than merely theoretical. Over the following days, Kenjiro found himself returning again and again to the American food station. Each visit reinforced his initial impression of genuine kindness and competent organization. The soldiers had learned the names of many of the regular visitors, and they greeted each person with individual attention and care. They had also begun expanding their operations, setting up additional feeding stations in different areas of the island to reach people who were too far away or too frightened to travel to the main camp. The changes in his family were remarkable and rapid. Yuki's energy returned first, and within a week, she was running around the cave and asking endless questions about their new circumstances. Her laughter, absent for so long that Kenjiro had almost forgotten the sound of it, began to fill their temporary home with music. Mariko's recovery took longer, but her strength gradually returned, and with it came a cautious optimism about their prospects for survival. But perhaps the most significant change was in Kenjiro himself. The constant fear that had dominated his thoughts for months began to recede, replaced by something he had almost stopped believing in: hope for the future. The Americans had demonstrated that former enemies could choose cooperation over revenge, that victors in war could be motivated by compassion rather than cruelty. If such transformation was possible on a personal level, perhaps it was also possible for entire societies. One morning, about 2 weeks after his first visit to the food station, Kenjiro was approached by the same soldier who had been so kind to him. The man had been studying Japanese with increasing dedication, and his attempts at conversation had become more sophisticated and successful. This time, he had a specific proposal to make. "Aoki-san," the soldier said, using Kenjiro's name with careful pronunciation. "You speak English, yes? Little bit?" Kenjiro nodded cautiously. His English was limited but functional, learned during his school years, when such education had been considered practical for international trade. "We need help," the soldier continued, mixing English and Japanese words as needed. "Japanese people still hiding, still afraid to come for food. You could help us find them, help us show them it's safe." The request was both reasonable and problematic. Kenjiro understood the practical benefits of helping to locate other survivors, people who were probably suffering just as his family had suffered. But becoming an active collaborator with the occupying forces would represent a fundamental shift in his role from recipient of charity to participant in the new order being established on Saipan. He asked for time to consider the proposal, and the soldier, whose name was Robert Chen, agreed readily. "No pressure," Chen assured him. "You think about it. But many people hungry, many people need help. You could make big difference." That night, as his family slept peacefully on bedding provided by the American quartermaster, Kenjiro wrestled with Chen's request. Every rational argument supported acceptance. He was already benefiting from American generosity. His family's lives had been saved by American food and medicine, and his knowledge of the local area and language could genuinely help save other lives. Yet something in him resisted taking what felt like a final step away from his old identity as a Japanese civilian and toward a new identity as someone who worked with the former enemy. The answer came to him while he was watching Yuki sleep. His daughter's face, peaceful and healthy in the dim light of their cave, reminded him that the categories of enemy and friend, Japanese and American, had already become irrelevant in the face of basic human needs. These soldiers had chosen to see her as a child who needed food rather than as the offspring of their former adversaries. They had chosen to see him as a father trying to care for his family rather than as a potential threat to be contained or eliminated. If they could make such choices, if they could transcend the artificial divisions created by war and politics, then perhaps he could do the same. Perhaps the truest way to honor both his Japanese identity and his newfound respect for American kindness was to become a balai, bridge between the two communities, helping to create understanding and cooperation where there had once been fear and hostility. The next morning, Kenjiro returned to the food station and sought out Robert Chen. "I will help," he said in English, the words feeling both foreign and right on his tongue. "I will help you find the others." Chen's face lit up with genuine pleasure and relief. "Thank you, Aoki-san. This will make very big difference for many people." And so began a new chapter in Kenjiro's life, one that would have been impossible to imagine during the dark days of hiding and starvation. Working alongside American soldiers who had become, against all odds, his friends and colleagues, he spent the following week seeking out survivors and convincing them to emerge from their hiding places. It was delicate work, requiring enormous patience and sensitivity, but gradually the population of fed and healthy civilians on Saipan began to grow. Each person he helped to safety, each family that was reunited with adequate food and medical care, felt like a small victory against the forces of division and hatred that war had unleashed on their island. Some of the survivors were easier to convince than others. Children, like Yuki and young Kenji, adapted quickly to the new reality of American protection and care. Adults took longer, their minds filled with years of propaganda and legitimate grievances, but most eventually came to understand that their survival depended on accepting help from their former enemies. The most difficult cases were the elderly, people whose memories of foreign occupation went back to other wars, other betrayals, other promises that had been broken. For these individuals, Kenjiro's role became particularly important. As someone they had known before the war, someone whose judgment they trusted, he could provide the personal reassurance that made the difference between continued hiding and acceptance of American aid. One particularly memorable day, Kenjiro was asked to help approach a group of survivors who had been spotted living in a complex of natural caves about 3 miles from the main camp. The intelligence reports suggested there might be as many as 20 people in this group, including several children, but all attempts to make contact had failed. The survivors would disappear deeper into the cave system whenever American patrols approached, and their fear seemed too great to be overcome by distant gestures of goodwill. Kenjiro volunteered to make the initial contact alone, arguing that a single Japanese civilian would be less threatening than any group that included American soldiers. Chen and the other officers were reluctant to let him go unescorted, worried about his safety in the rough terrain, but eventually they agreed to his plan. The hike to the cave complex was challenging but beautiful. Away from the areas that had been heavily damaged during the fighting, Saipan's natural beauty was still evident. Tropical vegetation had begun to reclaim some of the scarred landscape, and the morning air was filled with the songs of birds that had returned after fleeing the noise and smoke of battle. When Kenjiro reached the area where the survivors were reportedly hiding, he could see no immediate evidence of human presence. The caves appeared empty, the surrounding forest undisturbed. But he had learned during his own weeks of hiding to recognize the subtle signs that indicated people were living in concealment. A path that was too convenient to be entirely natural. Rocks arranged in patterns that suggested deliberate placement. Most telling of all, the complete absence of small animals in an area that should have been teeming with life. Instead of trying to penetrate the cave system, Kenjiro settled himself on a flat rock about 100 yards away and began to wait. He had brought food with him, bread and fruit, and some of the canned goods the Americans had been distributing, and he arranged these items in plain sight before sitting down to eat his own meal. The message was simple but clear. He had food, he was willing to share it, and he represented no immediate threat to anyone who might be watching. For most of the morning, nothing happened. The forest around him remained silent, except for the gradual return of bird songs and insect buzzing. But Kenjiro was patient, and his patience was eventually rewarded. Just after noon, he glimpsed movement in the shadows of the cave entrance. Too brief to be certain, but enough to suggest that his presence had been noted. He began to speak, not loudly but clearly enough for his words to carry to anyone who might be listening. He talked about his own family, about their weeks of hiding and fear, about the hunger that had finally driven them to seek help from the Americans. He described the kindness they had encountered, the generous portions of food, the medical care that had been provided without charge or conditions. Most importantly, He talked about the changes he had witnessed in himself and his family. "I was so afraid," he said, his words directed toward the cave entrance but meant for whoever might be hidden in the darkness beyond. "I thought they would hurt us, or take us away, or demand that we betray our friends and neighbors. But they asked for nothing except the chance to help. They treated my daughter like she was their own child." Gradually, almost imperceptibly, figures began to appear at the mouth of the cave. First just shapes in the shadows, then recognizable as people. Men and women and children, whose faces showed the same mixture of hope and terror that Kenjiro remembered from his own first encounter with the American Burl. Food station. The group that eventually emerged was larger than the intelligence reports had suggested, closer to 30 people than 20, and their condition was heartbreaking. These survivors had been living on even less than Kenjiro's family had managed to scavenge, and several of them appeared to be seriously ill from malnutrition and untreated injuries. Among them was an old man Kenjiro recognized as Professor Yamamoto, who had taught literature at the local school before the war, and whose presence lent authority to the group. Professor Yamamoto approached Kenjiro slowly, his dignity intact despite his obvious physical suffering. "Aoki-san," he said formally, "we have heard rumors about what you are doing with the American soldiers. Some of our people think you have become a collaborator." The accusation hung in the air like a challenge, and Kenjiro understood that his response would determine whether these people would accept his help or retreat back into their caves to continue their slow starvation in independence. "Professor," he replied with equal formality, "I have become something I never expected to be. I have become a man whose child is healthy and whose wife is strong. I have become someone who sleeps at night without fear that his family will die before morning. If that makes me a collaborator, then perhaps collaboration is not the evil word we once thought it was." The old teacher studied him for a long moment, weighing his words against decades of experience with foreign occupation and its consequences. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Show us," he said simply. "Show us this kindness you have found." The journey back to the American camp took most of the afternoon. As the weakened survivors could only manage a slow pace, with frequent rest stops. But it gave Kenjiro time to continue his explanations and reassurances, and by the time they reached the outskirts of the camp, even the most skeptical members of the group seemed cautiously optimistic about what they might find. The Americans were waiting for them, having been notified by radio that Kenjiro was returning with a large group of survivors. The welcome they provided exceeded even Kenjiro's expectations. Additional food stations had been quickly set up. Medical personnel were standing by to assess and treat anyone who needed care, and extra supplies of clothing and bedding had been gathered to help make the new arrivals comfortable. Robert Chen greeted each person individually, his improving Japanese allowing him to express genuine welcome and concern. Other soldiers had learned basic phrases of greeting and comfort, and the entire interaction felt more like a family reunion than a brab. Military operation. Professor Yamamoto, despite his initial skepticism, was visibly moved by the reception. When a young American medic knelt beside him to examine an infected cut on his leg, speaking softly in broken Japanese while cleaning the wound with copper-s. Obvious expertise and care, the old teacher's eyes filled with tears. "In all my years of studying literature," he whispered to Kenjiro, "I never encountered a story quite like this one." The transformation of the new arrivals began immediately and followed the same pattern Kenjiro had observed in his own family. The children recovered first, their natural resilience allowing them to adapt quickly to regular meals and safe surroundings. Within days, the sound of laughter was echoing through the camp, as kids who had barely spoken during their weeks of hiding began to play games and explore their new environment. The adults took longer, but gradually the tension and wariness that had defined their existence began to ease. Conversations that had been conducted in whispers during the months of hiding grew louder and more animated as people rediscovered the luxury of not having to fear being overheard. Plans began to emerge for the future. Tentative discussions about rebuilding homes and businesses and community institutions. Kenjiro found himself increasingly involved in these planning conversations, serving as a bridge between the American administrators who controlled resources and logistics and the Japanese civilians who understood local needs and priorities. His role evolved from simple translator to something more complex, a facilitator of cooperation between two groups who were learning to trust each other despite the recent history of warfare between their nations. The work was challenging but deeply satisfying. Each successful interaction between American soldiers and Japanese civilians felt like a small victory against the forces of hatred and division that war had unleashed. Every time a child accepted candy from a foreign soldier, every time an elderly person agreed to receive medical treatment from former enemies, every time practical cooperation replaced mutual suspicion, Kenjiro felt that he was witnessing something historically significant. 3 months after his first desperate journey toward the smell of baking bread, Kenjiro stood at the edge of what had once been the town square, watching American engineers work alongside Japanese civilians to clear debris and plan the reconstruction of essential buildings. The cooperation was not always smooth. There were language barriers and cultural misunderstandings and occasional flare-ups of old resentments. But the overall trend was clearly toward integration and mutual respect. His own family had thrived beyond his most optimistic expectations. Yuki had not only regained her health, but had actually grown taller and stronger than she had been before the war. Thanks to the consistent nutrition provided by American supplies, supplemented by local foods that were gradually becoming available again, she had also learned enough English to communicate directly with the soldiers, and several of them had become genuine friends who brought her small gifts and taught her American games. Mariko had emerged from her own recovery with a new sense of purpose and determination. She had begun organizing the other women in the camp to establish systems for childcare, cooking, and basic education, creating structure and community where there had been only chaos and fear. Her natural leadership abilities, suppressed during the desperate months of hiding, had reasserted themselves in ways that benefited everyone around her. But perhaps the most significant change was in the broader community of survivors. Where there had once been only a collection of desperate individuals focused solely on personal survival, there was now something that could genuinely be called a community again. People had rediscovered the capacity for mutual support and shared responsibility that had been lost during the worst days of the war. The American soldiers had played a crucial role in this transformation, not just through their provision of food and medical care, but through their consistent demonstration that former enemies could choose cooperation over revenge. Their example had inspired similar choices among the Japanese civilians, who had gradually overcome their own impulses toward suspicion and resentment. One particularly meaningful moment came when Professor Yamamoto approached Kenjiro with a proposal that seemed to capture the essence of what was happening on Saipan. The old teacher had been working with Robert Chen and several other American officers to establish a school for the children in the camp, and he wanted Kenjiro to serve as the principal liaison between American resources and Japanese educational traditions. "We have an opportunity here," the professor explained, "to create something new, something that honors the best of both cultures, while moving beyond the divisions that led to so much suffering. These children, Japanese and American, could grow up understanding each other in ways that their parents never could." The idea was ambitious and fraught with potential complications, but it represented exactly the kind of transformative possibility that had begun to seem achievable in the new atmosphere of cooperation and mutual respect. Kenjiro accepted the role eagerly, seeing it as a natural extension of the bridge-building work he had been doing since his first encounter with American kindness. The school project became a symbol of everything that was working well in the reconstruction of Saipan. American materials and logistical support, combined with Japanese cultural knowledge and educational philosophy to create something that neither group could have achieved alone. Children who had been traumatized by war and displacement began to heal through the simple routine of daily lessons and social interaction. More importantly, the school became a place where the artificial divisions created by national identity began to break down. American soldiers who volunteered as teachers discovered that Japanese children were not fundamentally different from the kids they had left behind in their own hometowns. Japanese parents who had initially been reluctant to trust their children to foreign influences gradually recognized that these young Americans genuinely cared about their students' welfare and success. 6 months after the bread smell had first drawn him toward the American camp, Kenjiro received an unexpected visitor. Robert Chen arrived at his family's new quarters, an actual house that had been rebuilt with American materials and Japanese labor. Carrying an official-looking envelope and wearing an expression of nervous excitement. "Aoki-san," Chen said, his Japanese now fluent enough for complex conversations. "I have something important to discuss with you. The military government is establishing a civilian advisory council to help with reconstruction planning, and they want you to serve as one of the Japanese representatives. The position would carry real authority and responsibility, involving Kenjiro in decisions about infrastructure development, resource allocation, and long-term planning for the island's future. It would also make him one of the most visible symbols of Japanese-American cooperation, a role that would attract both praise and criticism from various quarters." Kenjiro accepted without hesitation, understanding that his personal journey from hiding survivor to community leader had prepared him for exactly this kind of responsibility. The frightened man who had once crept through rubble toward the smell of teen bread had been transformed by months of witnessing and facilitating cooperation between former enemies into someone capable of helping to build a genuinely integrated society. The advisory council meetings became exercises in creative problem-solving and cultural translation. American efficiency and Japanese attention to detail proved to be complementary rather than conflicting approaches to most challenges. When disagreements arose, they were generally based on practical considerations rather than fundamental philosophical differences, and they could usually be resolved through patient discussion and compromise. One of the most significant projects undertaken by the council was the development of a new economic system for the island. The traditional pre-war economy had been destroyed by the fighting, but rather than simply imposing American models or attempting to recreate Japanese systems, the council worked to design something that incorporated the best features of both approaches. Local businesses were encouraged to reopen with American capital investment and technical assistance, but they were allowed to maintain traditional Japanese management styles and customer service approaches. American agricultural techniques were introduced to improve crop yields, but they were adapted to work with local growing conditions and food preferences. The result was an economic revival that happened faster and more sustainably than anyone had initially thought possible. The personal relationships that developed during this period of reconstruction proved to be as important as the official policies and programs. Kenjiro's friendship with Robert Chen deepened into something that transcended their different backgrounds and experiences. They discovered shared interests in literature and philosophy, and their conversations often extended far beyond the practical matters of administration and planning. Chen had become genuinely fluent in Japanese, not just the basic vocabulary needed for official duties, but the nuanced language of poetry and cultural expression. He had also developed a deep appreciation for Japanese aesthetics and traditions, incorporating elements of local design and ceremony into his own living space and daily routines. Similarly, Kenjiro had progressed far beyond basic English into sophisticated understanding of American cultural references and social patterns. He had begun reading American literature and newspapers, not just for practical information but for the pleasure of engaging with different ways of thinking about universal human experiences. Their friendship became a model for what was possible when people chose to see each other as individuals rather than representatives of hostile nations. Other soldiers and civilians followed their example, creating a network of personal relationships that made the official cooperation programs much more effective and sustainable. A year after his first desperate search for food, Kenjiro stood on the same hill where he had once hidden and watched American soldiers with fear and suspicion. The view had changed dramatically. Where there had once been ruins and devastation, there were now rebuilt homes and businesses. Where there had once been separation and hostility, there were now integrated neighborhoods where Japanese families and American personnel lived as neighbors and friends. The changes were not just physical but spiritual and emotional. The atmosphere of fear and desperation that had dominated the island during the war and its immediate aftermath had been replaced by something that could genuinely be called hope. People make plans for the future with confidence that they would be alive to see those plans fulfilled. Children played without constantly looking over their shoulders for signs of danger. Adults engaged in work and community activities with energy and enthusiasm that had been impossible during the dark months of survival and hiding. Kenjiro's own transformation had been as complete as that of the island itself. The man who had once defined himself primarily as a survivor, someone whose highest aspiration was simply staying alive until tomorrow, had become a leader and visionary, actively working to create a better future for his community and his children. The most profound change, however, was in his understanding of what was possible between people who had every reason to hate each other. The American soldiers who had fed his family when they were starving had demonstrated that the choice between revenge and mercy was exactly that, a choice. They had shown that victory in war did not have to mean the humiliation and suffering of the defeated. That former enemies could become not just allies, but genuine friends. This lesson had implications that extended far beyond the specific circumstances of Saipan's reconstruction. If Japanese civilians and American soldiers could learn to trust and respect each other after such a bitter conflict, then perhaps other seemingly impossible reconciliations were also achievable. Perhaps the cycle of hatred and revenge that had dominated so much of human history was not as inevitable as it had once seemed. The bread that had first drawn Kenjiro toward the American camp had been more than simple nourishment for hungry bodies. It had been a symbol of abundance replacing scarcity, of generosity replacing selfishness, of hope replacing despair. Most importantly, it had been proof that even in the aftermath of war, people could choose to see their former enemies as fellow human beings deserving of compassion and care. 2 years after the end of the fighting, Kenjiro received word that Robert Chen would soon be returning to the United States as part of the gradual reduction of American military presence on Saipan. The news filled him with sadness at the prospect of losing a dear friend, but also with pride at how much they had accomplished together during their unlikely partnership. The farewell ceremony organized by the Civilian Advisory Council was attended by hundreds of people, both Japanese and American, whose lives had been touched by Chen's service and friendship. Speaker after speaker testified to his kindness, his competence, and his genuine respect for the people he had been assigned to help govern. But perhaps the most meaningful tribute came from young Yuki, now 7 years old and fluent in both languages, who presented Chen with a handwritten letter thanking him for making my daddy smile again. Chen's replacement was a capable and well-intentioned officer, but the transition highlighted how much the success of the reconstruction effort had depended on personal relationships and individual choices rather than just official policies and procedures. The new administration continued the programs that had been established, but something of the spirit and energy that had characterized the early period was inevitably lost. Still, the foundation that had been built during those crucial first years proved to be solid and enduring. The economic systems that had been established continued to function and grow. The educational programs that had been developed continued to produce students who were comfortable in both Japanese and American cultural contexts. Most importantly, the habit of cooperation and mutual respect that had been cultivated between the two communities continued to shape daily interactions and long-term planning. 5 years after the war's end, Kenjiro was elected as the first Japanese mayor of the reconstructed town that had emerged from the ruins of his old neighborhood. His campaign had focused on continuing the integration and development that had transformed Saipan from a devastated battleground into a thriving community. And his victory represented a kind of completion of the journey that had begun with his desperate search for bread. The inauguration ceremony was held in the new town square, built on the same site where Kenjiro had once hidden among the rubble and watched American soldiers with fear and suspicion. The crowd that gathered to witness his swearing in included people of many backgrounds and nationalities, but the distinction between former enemies and former allies had largely ceased to matter in the daily life of the Emperor community. In his inaugural address, Kenjiro spoke about the lessons that Saipan's reconstruction had taught, about the possibility of transformation and reconciliation. "We learned," he said, "that bread shared between strangers can become the foundation for friendship between peoples. We learn that former enemies can choose to become partners in building something better than what existed before. Importantly, we learned that the future does not have to be limited by the past, that people can choose mercy over revenge, cooperation over conflict, hope over despair." End quote. The audience, which included many of the American soldiers and officials who had made the Reconstruction possible, responded with sustained applause that seemed to echo across the years to that moment when a hungry father had first smelled fresh bread and decided to trust in the possibility of unexpected kindness. 10 years later, when Kenjiro was in his 50s and Yuki was preparing to leave for university studies in the United States, he often returned to the hill where he had once hidden and contemplated the extraordinary journey that had brought him from desperation to leadership, from fear to hope, from isolation to community. The bread that had started it all was still being baked daily in the town's several bakeries. Some operated by Japanese families, others by American veterans who had chosen to make Saipan their permanent home, and still others by partnerships between the two communities. The smell of fresh bread no longer signaled desperate hunger, but instead represented abundance, cooperation, and the continuing possibility of choosing mercy over vengeance in a world that too often chose otherwise. Kenjiro's story had become part of the island's official history, taught in schools as an example of how individuals could make choices that transformed not just their own lives, but entire communities. But for him, the most important legacy was not the historical record, but the living proof that surrounded him daily, the evidence that people who had every reason to hate each other had instead chosen to build something beautiful together. As he watched the sun set over the reconstructed town, Kenjiro reflected on the simple truth that had changed everything. That bread shared between strangers could indeed become the foundation for friendship between peoples, and that such friendship, once established, could survive and flourish even in the most unlikely circumstances. The smell of fresh bread still filled the evening air, but now it carried with it the promise of tomorrow's possibilities, rather than the desperate hope of merely surviving until morning. The years that followed brought new challenges and opportunities that tested the foundations of cooperation that had been so carefully built. When news arrived that the United States and Japan had signed a formal peace treaty, ending the state of war that had officially existed since 1941, the celebration on Saipan was unlike anything the Fur Island had ever witnessed. Japanese and American flags flew side by side from every building, and the festivities continued for 3 days with food, music, and dancing that blended traditions from both cultures. But the treaty also brought uncertainty about the future status of the island and its unique experiment in cooperation. Would the special circumstances that had allowed former enemies to become partners survive the transition to formal peacetime relationships? Would the personal bonds that had been forged between individuals withstand the pressures of official diplomacy and international politics? These questions became more pressing when a delegation of officials from Tokyo arrived to assess the situation on Saipan and report back to the Japanese government about conditions among the civilian population. The delegation included bureaucrats, journalists, and even some former military officers who had served in the Pacific Theater during the war. Their mission was to determine whether the Japanese residents of Saipan were being treated fairly under American administration, and whether any measures needed to be taken to protect their rights and interests. Kenjiro found himself in the delicate position of serving as the primary liaison between the visiting delegation and the American military government. Some members of the Tokyo group arrived with preconceptions about American occupation policies based on experiences in other locations, and they were clearly skeptical about reports of cooperation and mutual respect on Saipan. Others seemed more open-minded but cautious, unwilling to draw conclusions until they had seen the situation firsthand. The tour that Kenjiro organized for the delegation was carefully planned to showcase the reality of daily life in the reconstructed community. They visited the integrated schools where Japanese and American children learned together, observed the joint planning meetings where infrastructure projects were designed and implemented, and met with families who had benefited from American medical care and economic assistance. Perhaps most importantly, they witnessed the informal social interactions that had become commonplace on the island. They saw Japanese shopkeepers chatting comfortably with American customers, watched mixed groups of children playing games that combined elements from both cultures, and observed the easy camaraderie between Japanese workers and American supervisors on construction sites. The most skeptical member of the delegation was Colonel Tanaka, a former officer who had fought against American forces in the Philippines and who arrived on Saipan expecting to find evidence of oppression and brass cultural suppression. His first conversations with Kenjiro were formal and suspicious, filled with leading questions designed to uncover hidden grievances and suppressed resentments. Surely, Colonel Tanaka suggested during their initial meeting, there must be tensions beneath the surface. The Americans may appear friendly, but their ultimate goal must be to transform this island into an extension of their own territory, eliminating Japanese culture and identity in the process. Kenjiro understood the colonel's concerns, which reflected legitimate worries about cultural preservation and political autonomy that many Japanese people harbored about American occupation policies. But he also knew that the reality on Saipan was far more complex and positive than the colonel's assumptions allowed for. "Colonel," Kenjiro replied respectfully, "I invite you to spend time with our people, to observe our daily life, to speak with our children and our elders. Judge for yourself whether our culture is being suppressed or whether it is being allowed to flourish alongside American culture in ways that enrich both communities." The challenge was accepted, and over the following week, Colonel Tanaka immersed himself in the life of the island with the thoroughness of a military reconnaissance mission. He attended town meetings, visited classrooms, inspected construction projects, and conducted dozens of informal interviews with residents of all ages and backgrounds. The transformation in the colonel's perspective was gradual but unmistakable. He began to understand that the cooperation he was witnessing was not the result of coercion or manipulation, but of genuine mutual respect and shared commitment to building something better than what had existed before the war. He saw that Japanese culture was not being suppressed, but was instead being celebrated and preserved, often with active support from American administrators who recognized its value and beauty. The turning point came when Colonel Tanaka attended a cultural festival that had been organized to celebrate the completion of a new community center. The event featured traditional Japanese music and dance, but it also included American folk songs and square dancing. What struck the colonel most powerfully was not the mixing of cultural elements, but the joy and pride with which people from both communities participated in celebrating each other's traditions. He watched as Robert Chen, who was nearing the end of his tour of duty, performed a traditional Japanese tea ceremony that he had learned from Professor Yamamoto. The American soldiers' movements were careful and respectful, clearly the result of months of patient instruction and practice. When he served tea to elderly Japanese residents who had initially been among the most suspicious of American intentions, their faces showed genuine appreciation for his effort to honor their cultural traditions. Later that evening, Colonel Tanaka sought out Kenjiro for a private conversation. "I came here expecting to find evidence of cultural imperialism," he admitted with characteristic directness. "Instead, I have found something that challenges my understanding of what is possible between former enemies. How did this happen? How did you overcome the hatred and suspicion that war inevitably creates?" Kenjiro considered the question carefully before responding. "It began with bread," he said simply. "When my family was starving, American soldiers chose to feed us rather than ignore our suffering. That single act of mercy opened a door that we all chose to walk through together. But the real transformation happened because individuals on both sides decided that cooperation was more valuable than revenge, that building something new was more important than preserving old grievances." End quote. The colonel nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "And you believe this model could work elsewhere? In other situations where former enemies must learn to coexist?" "I believe," Kenjiro replied, "that it works whenever people choose to see each other as human beings, rather than as representatives of hostile groups. The circumstances here were unique, but the choices we made are available to anyone willing to make them." When the delegation returned to Tokyo, their report created considerable discussion within government circles and in the media. Colonel Tanaka, in particular, became an unexpected advocate for the Saipan model of cooperation and reconciliation. His testimony before government committees and his articles in military journals helped to spread awareness of what had been achieved on the island and contributed to broader discussions about post-war reconstruction and international relations. But the real test of the island's achievements came with the arrival of a new challenge that nobody had anticipated. A severe typhoon struck Saipan in late 1951, bringing winds of more than 150 miles per hour and destroying much of the infrastructure that had been so carefully rebuilt over the previous years. The storm's immediate aftermath presented a crisis that could have shattered the cooperative relationships that had been built between the Japanese and American communities. Resources were suddenly scarce again, communications were disrupted, and the focus had to shift from long-term development to immediate survival. Under such pressure, it would have been natural for people to retreat into ethnic or national groupings, to prioritize the welfare of their own kind over the broader community good. Instead, the response to the typhoon demonstrated just how deeply the habits of cooperation had become embedded in the island's culture. Without waiting for official instructions or formal coordination, mixed groups of Japanese civilians and American personnel began working together to rescue trapped survivors, distribute emergency supplies, and restore essential services. The disaster response was remarkably efficient, precisely because people had learned to work together across cultural and linguistic barriers. Kenjiro found himself once again in a coordinating role, but now his function was less about building bridges between separate communities and more about helping a truly integrated society respond to a common crisis. The distinction was significant, representing the completion of a transformation that had begun with his desperate search for food years earlier. One of the most moving moments of the recovery effort came when a group of elderly Japanese residents, led by Professor Yamamoto, volunteered to help rebuild the American military chapel that had been destroyed by the storm. These were people who had practiced Buddhism and Shintoism all their lives, who had no personal connection to Christian worship, but who understood that the chapel was important to their American neighbors and friends. Working alongside American soldiers and Japanese carpenters, the elderly volunteers spent weeks carefully reconstructing the building according to its original design. When the work was completed, they attended the rededication ceremony, not as outsiders observing a foreign ritual, but as community members celebrating the restoration of an important gathering place for their neighbors. The gesture was reciprocated several months later when American personnel volunteered their time and skills to help rebuild a Buddhist temple that had also been damaged by the typhoon. The cross-cultural cooperation required for this project was even more complex, as the Americans had to learn about architectural principles and religious requirements that were completely unfamiliar to them. But they approached the task with the same respect and dedication that the Japanese volunteers had shown in rebuilding the chapel. These projects became symbols of how completely the artificial barriers between former enemies had been dissolved. People were working together not because they were required to do so by official policy, but because they had genuinely come to care about each other's welfare and happiness. The community that emerged from the typhoon recovery was stronger and more cohesive than the one that had existed before the storm. The success of the recovery effort attracted attention from development experts and international relations scholars who were studying post-war reconstruction efforts around the world. Delegations began arriving from other regions where former enemies were attempting to build peaceful coexistence, hoping to learn lessons that could be applied in their own contexts. Kenjiro became an increasingly sought-after speaker and consultant, traveling to conferences and workshops where he shared the story of Saipan's transformation. His message was always the same, that reconciliation between former enemies was possible, but only if individuals on both sides were willing to make the choice to see each other as human beings deserving of respect and compassion. But even as he gained recognition for his role in Saipan's success story, Kenjiro remained fundamentally committed to his work on the island itself. He understood that the relationships and institutions that had been built required constant nurturing and attention to survive and thrive. The cooperation that seemed so natural and effortless to outside observers was actually the result of daily choices by hundreds of individuals to prioritize community welfare over narrow self-interest. The most significant test of this commitment came when the American military presence on Saipan was scheduled to be substantially reduced as part of broader changes in Pacific defense strategy. The announcement created anxiety among both Japanese and American residents who had come to value the integrated community they had built together. Would the special character of the island survive the departure of many of the American personnel who had been instrumental in creating it? The question was answered through a series of remarkable decisions that demonstrated just how deeply the values of cooperation and mutual respect had taken root. Many American soldiers and civilians who had been scheduled for reassignment chose instead to extend their tours of duty or even to retire early in order to remain on Saipan permanently. Simultaneously, the Japanese government and the American military worked together to develop new arrangements that would maintain the island's unique character while respecting the sovereignty and security concerns of both nations. The solution that emerged was innovative and unprecedented. Saipan would become a special administrative zone that remained under overall American security control, but with extensive local autonomy and press. Guaranteed cultural rights for all residents. The civilian government would be fully integrated, with leadership positions shared between Japanese and American residents based on qualifications and community support rather than national origin. Kenjiro was elected as the first mayor under this new arrangement, a position that carried both symbolic and practical significance. His inauguration ceremony was attended by high-ranking officials from both the Japanese and American governments, but the most meaningful moment came when Yuki, now a college graduate and fluent in multiple Bane languages, delivered the benediction in which she thanked all the people who had chosen mercy over vengeance and cooperation over conflict. The ceremony concluded with the cutting of a ceremonial loaf of bread, baked using a recipe that combined Japanese and American techniques and ingredients. As Kenjiro held the knife, he thought about the journey that had brought him from desperate hunger to community leadership, from fear of enemies to friendship with former adversaries. The bread that had once meant the difference between life and death for his family had become a symbol of abundance, cooperation, and hope for the future. The years that followed brought new challenges and opportunities, but they also confirmed that the foundation of mutual respect and cooperation that had been built on Saipan was strong enough to survive changes in leadership, shifts in international politics, and the natural evolution of community life. Children who had grown up in the integrated society took its values for granted, seeing cooperation across cultural boundaries as normal rather than exceptional. Some of these children went on to become leaders in international diplomacy, development work, and conflict resolution, carrying the lessons they had learned on Saipan to other parts of the world where former enemies struggled to find ways to coexist peacefully. Others remained on the island to continue the work of building and maintaining the unique community that had nurtured them, ensuring that the spirit of cooperation and mutual respect would be passed on to future generations. 25 years after the typhoon that had tested the island's commitment to cooperation, Kenjiro stood once again on the hill where he had once hidden in fear and desperation. The view before him was almost unrecognizable from the devastated landscape he had surveyed during those dark days of survival and hiding. Where there had once been rubble and ruin, there was now a thriving city that seamlessly blended architectural styles and cultural influences from multiple traditions. The success of the Saipan experiment had inspired similar efforts in other post-conflict regions, though none had achieved quite the same level of integration and mutual trust. Kenjiro took pride in knowing that his community had served as a proof of concept for the possibility of genuine reconciliation between former enemies. But he also understood that each situation was unique and required its own approaches and solutions. What remained constant across all successful reconciliation efforts, he had learned, was the fundamental choice that individuals had to make between revenge and mercy, between suspicion and trust, between, quote, isolation and cooperation. The bread that had first drawn him toward American soldiers had represented that choice in its simplest and most powerful form, the choice to feed the hungry rather than to ignore their suffering, to show mercy rather than to demand vengeance. As the sun set over the peaceful community that had grown from the ashes of war and hatred, Kenjiro reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought him from desperation to hope, from fear to friendship, from survival to service. The smell of fresh bread still filled the evening air, but now it carried with it not just the promise of tomorrow's possibilities, but the proven reality that former enemies could indeed choose to become partners in building something beautiful together.